The boys who were in Freddie Mercury's first band did not know he was Freddie Mercury. Not for a few years, not for a decade, they found out after he died. One of them was handed a magazine cutting, years later, that mentioned a school band in India called the Hectics. He read it and realized that the boy he had played music with at boarding school, a quiet kid everyone called Bucky, had become the most famous frontman in the world. The story starts in a hill town called Panchgani, about 150 miles from Bombay. It is a small place, high up, cool in a way most of India is not. The British had built schools there in the 1800s precisely because of the climate. By the 1950s, it was still full of them. One of those schools was St. Peter's English boarding school, English rules, English lessons, thousands of miles from England. In 1954, a boy named Farrokh Bulsara arrived there. He was 8 years old. His family were Parsis, and they were not in India. They lived in Zanzibar, off the coast of East Africa, where his father worked as a cashier for the British colonial government. 8 years old, and his parents put him on a boat, sent him across the Arabian Sea to a country he had never lived in, to be raised by a school. This was not unusual for families like his. It was, in a sense, what you did if you could afford it. An English education was the thing you bought for your children when you wanted them to have options. But describe the same arrangement without the context, and it is stark. A small boy alone, 4,000 kilometers from his mother, in a dormitory for years at a time. He went home for holidays. The rest of the year he belonged to St. Peter's. The school gave him a new name almost immediately. Farrokh became Freddie there, not later, not in London, not when he joined a band. At St. Peter's as a child. There is some disagreement about whether the school gave it to him or whether he took it himself. What is not in dispute is that by the time he left India, the boy his family called Farrokh was Freddie to everyone else. His school friends had another name for him. They called him Bucky because of his teeth. That detail matters more than it looks. The teeth were the result of 4 extra ones at the back of his mouth, pushing the front ones forward. He was self-conscious about them his entire life. There is a well-known story that he refused to have them fixed even after he became famous, because he believed the extra space affected his voice. But at school in the 1950s, they were simply the reason for a nickname, Bucky. It is worth sitting with what a school like that actually was. St. Peter's ran on the English public school model, transplanted whole. House systems, uniforms, chapel, cricket prefects. Boys were sorted, ranked, and expected to become a particular kind of person. For a Parsi child from Zanzibar, this meant being educated into an identity that was not his family's, in a language that was not his first, surrounded by boys doing exactly the same thing. Nobody at that school was entirely from where they were. That is worth remembering when people describe Freddie Mercury as someone who invented himself. He grew up somewhere that required it of everybody. He was, by the accounts of the people who were there, a good student and an obvious musician. The school noticed the piano first. He took lessons, he was good at them, and he passed his practical and theory exams at a high grade. This was not a boy fumbling towards music. He could actually play. What he was not at that point was a singer that anyone remarked upon. Then in 1958, a boy called Bruce Murray had an idea. Murray wanted to start a band, not Freddie. This is one of the small facts that gets rewritten constantly in the retellings because it does not fit the story people want. The most celebrated frontman in the history of rock music did not start his first band. He was invited into somebody else's. They called themselves the Hectics. Bruce Murray sang lead and played guitar. Derek Branch was on guitar. Victory Rana played drums. Faring Irani was on bass. And Freddie Mercury, aged 12, sat at the piano. Read that lineup again, because it is genuinely strange in hindsight. The band had a frontman, and it was not him. There was a boy standing at the front holding a microphone, and Freddie was behind him at the keys. Whatever the thing was that would later make 150,000 people at Wembley move as one body, it was not visible enough at 12 for anybody to put him at the front of a 5-piece school band. What they played was what boys everywhere were playing in 1958. Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Cliff Richard, rock and roll, arriving in a hill station in India roughly 2 years after it arrived anywhere else, carried in on records and radio. Little Richard matters especially here. Piano-driven, theatrical, shouted rather than sung, entirely built on personality. The 12-year-old at the piano was learning those songs from the inside, at the instrument they were written on. The Hectics became genuinely popular in Panchgani. They played school dances and functions. Students from other schools in the town came to watch them. By the accounts of the people who were there, the girls in particular turned up. For 4 years, between 1958 and 1962, a group of schoolboys in a small Indian hill town had something close to local fame. There is one more thing about those 4 years that is easy to miss. A school band that plays regularly for 4 years is not a hobby. It is a working apprenticeship, learning a set, holding an audience that did not come specifically for you, playing badly one week and better the next in front of the same faces. Most musicians get that experience in their late teens or 20s, in pubs, badly paid. Freddie got it between the ages of 12 and 16, in a controlled environment with a guaranteed audience every time. By the time he arrived in England, he had already done 4 years of live performance. He simply had not done any of it at the front. And then it ended the way school bands end. Everyone left. Freddie finished at St. Peter's and returned to Zanzibar in 1963, 17 years old, back to his family and the island. He did not stay long. In 1964, the Zanzibar Revolution swept the islands, thousands of people were killed, and the Bulsara family left with almost nothing. They arrived in England as refugees and settled in Feltham in Middlesex. Consider what that means for the boy's timeline. Born in Zanzibar, educated in India, displaced by a revolution at 18, landed in a London suburb where nobody had heard of any of it. By the time he was 20, Farrokh Bulsara had lived in 3 countries, been sent away from home once by his parents and once by history, and had already been someone called Freddie for a decade. He did not become Freddie Mercury for another 6 years. The band that would matter formed in 1970. It was during that period that he took the surname, and the story he gave for it points back at his own song, My Fairy King, and the line about Mother Mercury. But the first name was not new. He had been Freddie since Panchgani. The invention was only half an invention. He had been building the character since he was a child in a dormitory. Now come back to where this started. The other 4 Hectics went on with their lives. Bruce Murray, Derek Branch, Victory Rana, Farrokh Irani, India and elsewhere, and ordinary careers. None of them knew. Queen became one of the biggest bands on the planet through the 1970s and 80s, and the boys who had shared a stage with the singer had no idea it was the same person. There is a simple reason for that, and it is the whole story in one detail. They had known a Parsi boy from Zanzibar named Farrokh Bulsara, who played piano in a school band and answered to Bucky. They had never heard of anybody called Freddie Mercury. The name he took in 1970 did not just give him a stage identity. It severed him, completely and apparently accidentally, from everyone who had known him as a child. He died in November of 1991. It was afterwards, in the enormous global coverage that followed, that the pieces started reaching the people who had been there. A magazine cutting, a photograph, a mention of a boarding school band in India. And a man in his 40s or 50s, somewhere, reading a name he had not thought about in 30 years and realizing who Bucky had turned out to be. There is a version of Freddie Mercury's story that begins in London in 1970, with a name change and a band, and an ambition that seems to arrive from nowhere. It is much more interesting than that. Before any of it, there was a boy sent across an ocean at 8, given a new first name by a school, taught piano properly, and put in a band by somebody else at the back behind a different singer. Everything he became was assembled in a hill town in India, in front of an audience of schoolchildren, by people who never found out what they had watched.